In this video, we're going to create a simple podcast player using AgGrid. We're going to give it the URL for the podcast. We're going to parse the XML file to get all the title names and MP3 names, and we're going to show an audio player in the grid in order to let us play any episode that we want. If you want to jump ahead and look at the source code, that's all at github.com ag-grid/react-data-grid, and it's in the podcast player folder. There are some prerequisites. We're going to need to have Node.js installed, and I'm going to use Visual Studio Code as my main editor. And I'm going to do all this from scratch, so some parts may be sped up. Well, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to npx create React app, and I'll say the podcast player. And this will set up the basic structure for the project. And because it will take a little bit of time, we'll fast forward. Now let's cd into the folder. And we're going to install AgGrid. And I'm going to use AgGrid Community here, which is free to use. And you can then see the features that come for free with AgGrid. And we're also going to build this in React. So I'll install AgGrid React Wrapper, which is the React user interface for AgGrid. And we'll just fast forward through this install process as well. Okay, so now we have everything installed. I'm just going to load that project into Visual Studio Code. Even though at this point there's no code in there, we'll just open up the project. Okay, now we're ready to get started. Let me open up the terminal in the Visual Studio Code. I'll just make sure I'm running bash there. There we go. All right, let's see what we've got in here. Create React App has created an app.js for us. And what I have in mind is that we will have a heading that says podcast player and a couple of controls to let us define the input feed and buttons to load the feed. And then we'll have a grid, and that will basically display the title and the date of the podcast, and it will have some sort of control to let me play the MP3 for the podcast. That's my basic design that I'm going to have. And to keep it simple, I'm going to put most of it in a control. So I'll have my H1, which will be the podcast player, and I'm just going to have a React control here called the podcast grid. And I'll need to give that an RSS feed. We'll figure that out in just a second. I'm going to give it a height, 500 pixels. And I'm going to give that a width. And I'll make the width 100% of the screen. So that's nice and simple. And then we'll close that off. Now I haven't created this component yet, so we'll do that in just a second. Now I thought for the RSS feed, what I'd do is I'd use the WebRush podcast, and the feed for that is there. So if I copy link address, paste the feed in there, we can see that this is actually an XML formatted file, so I'll have to write some XML parsing, but I won't worry about that yet. I'll just put in the feed. So I'm hard coding this, so when the podcast player renders, we'll have a feed ready to go. So let's do an npm start here to have the application running in the background. Good. So I have started my application, and we can see that the podcast grid component hasn't been created yet because we haven't started writing that. So I'm going to start writing that now. So in source, I'll just create my new file for the podcast grid. And initially this would just be boilerplate code to compile and render a simple grid with test data. So I'll need to import React, and from React, I'll have the use effect and use state. And I will import AgGrid React, which is the UI that AgGrid provided for React. And we'll import some CSS styling as well. And I'll want styles, and we'll have the AgGrid CSS. And I'll bring in a theme, and we'll use the Alpine theme. So I'll want my podcast to be a component here. So export as a function, the podcast grid. Now I need to pass in the props so that we can access them in here. And this will just be a very quick render at the moment just to get something working. So I'll say we want a div with a class name of AG theme Alpine. And I'll style this to have the correct width and height. So I want height to be the props we passed in, and the width again to be the props that we've passed in. And within this div, I'll want to render an AG grid React, which is the AG grid component. So that should give us a grid on the screen. Hopefully, if I've done that right, let me save that. And of course, we need to import that. So let's import the podcast grid from /podcast grid. Save that, compiling, and there we go. So I've got a podcast player heading and my grid is saying loading because we haven't given it any data. So that's a good start. Now, if anything failed at this point, I would check my React installation. I would check that I'd imported the AG grid dependencies. I might even follow one of the tutorials on the AG grid site, so in the getting started guide in the documentation, or possibly one of the getting started guides on the blog. So in the React section, there's a whole bunch of getting started guides. We've got getting started guides for using hooks and classes. And again, these just walk you through the basic process for starting up a project. But we have now created a basic podcast grid component that we're going to now populate to read from an RSS file. So much of the work that we're going to do now is going to be based in the podcast grid.js file. So let me just format this a little bit. Okay, so most of our code will be in here. Now I'm going to take my design, and the grid part of my design is basically this. So let's start by having the grid display 3 columns, title, date, and playable, or something similar. So I'm going to create some column definitions, which is going to define how the grid is going to render some data. Now this is basically an array of objects, and each of the objects is going to have a header name. So I think let's make this the episode title, and we'll have a field that it will bring in the information from called title. So at this point, I'm just defining what the column is going to look like, but I'm not going to pass in any data yet. So let's have another object for header name. This will be the published date, and this will map onto a field in the data called pub date. And then finally, let's have a header name called episode, and this will map onto a field called mp3. All right, let me format this and quickly review the code to make sure it's going to work. So all the header names are correct. Doesn't look like there's any syntax errors there. Okay, so I've got a bunch of column defs. So what I do now is I add that into the grid, and this is a grid property. So I'll add in the column defs, and this will take it from the value that we've set up. And if I save this, the app should refresh, and there we can see we've got the episode title, the published date, and the episode itself. All we really have to do now is populate data in there. So to do that, I will hard code some data in initially just to get the state working, because the data that we're going to load in is going to come from the state in the component. So set row data, and initially let's just use some hard coded values just to make sure that we're rendering this correctly and we've got everything set up. So the hard coded values again are going to be an array, and we know what the fields are. We've got a field called title, and this will map onto the episode title column, and we're going to have a pub date, and that's going to be an actual date to allow sorting and things to happen later. And we'll have an mp3 value, which will be a URL. So I'm just going to hard code in something that looks like a URL. Well, it is a URL, it just won't have anything in the back of it. My podcast /episode mp3, because I'm expecting that to be an mp3 file, and the title will be my episode. So if I save this, hopefully that will render in the grid, and we can then concentrate on adding some actual data. So what was the mistake that I made there? Oops, use state again. So that's why I made the mistake in the import at the top. Now that I have data, I need to actually set that into my grid, which again, I can do down here as a grid property, and we'll pass in row data equals the row data from the state. And there we go. So I've got my hard-coded data values in there. I can see that I've set up a grid. So once I can read in data from an RSS feed, that should be rendering fine in my grid. What I'm doing is I'm approaching this in tiny little incremental steps to de-risk any technical issues that I might face. I should make sure that I save this app.js just in case I made any mistakes in there, which I haven't. So now we've got a set of hard-coded data in the row data for the state. We've created some column definitions. This maps onto our title, our pub date, and our MP3. And we've got a basic grid, and the grid is being populated by the state, so we can change that quite easily, and the column definitions that we've added here in code. So the next thing I'm going to want to do is get rid of this hard-coded data and pass in some data from the RSS feed from the podcast. Now, the podcast that we're using is the WebRush podcast, which is a JavaScript podcast. And if I put this RSS feed in here, we can see that it's an XML file. Now, RSS is a standard format, so there is a specification for it. I can read that in order to understand more about it. But what I'm going to focus on is simply parsing the RSS feed that is associated with a podcast. So looking through this, I can see that the information I want to pull out is contained in these item elements, which is the container for a title that we'll want to render on screen, a description, which we won't use yet, but that might be useful later on for searching and filtering. We've got the pub date, and here is the enclosure, which contains the MP3 file. So if I can get the item containers, and I can then pull out the title and display it, we should be good to go. Now, XML can often seem a little bit hard to work with, but with JavaScript, we do have some built-in functionality to help us. So if I in here create a parser for my XML, and I'm going to use a built-in parser with JavaScript, which, because we're running in a browser and the browser knows how to handle HTML, it knows also how to handle XML. So we're going to use the DOM parser, and then I'll say that the data is the parser, and this will parse from string, and we'll pass in an RSS feed. I'm just making the assumption that we can get the RSS feed, and this is in format text XML. So let's put this in a fetch. So I'm going to want to fetch from the RSS feed. Then having fetched it, I want to deal with the response. And from the response, I'm going to want the text of the message. So you can see that the text that comes back when we hit this is an XML file. Then I'm going to want to take that string and basically pass it into this code that I've just written here. So the string is this RSS feed. So I'm fetching the RSS feed we pass in as props, getting the response and getting the text of that response, creating a parser and parsing the text response that came in as XML. Then I will want to get the list of items, which I can do very simply now because I can use the standard DOM manipulation and interrogation methods. So I can query selector all and get all the items. So that will return all the item elements. And because we are using React, I'll want this as an effect, and I'll want to run this code when the RSS feed value changes for our component. So what I really want to do now is take my item list and pass it into the grid. So for each of the items in here, so I've got item list for each, and that will give me an element. And for that element, I want to, let's create an array, and I'll put all the information in this array. So I will want in items to add an object, and the object will contain the fields that we're looking for. So it will have the title. The title is coming from the title in the XML, and I'll want the inner HTML for that. And we'll want the pub date, and that will be a new date which is taken from the query selector for pub date. And let's get the text content for that. And we'll also want the MP3, which is coming from the query selector for the enclosure. So there's the title with the inner HTML. We want the enclosure, and then I'll need to get the URL attribute from that. So enclosure, and we'll get the attribute for the URL, and that should be it. So let's have a look. We've got a use effect, which is doing a fetch to get a response, where we take the text, then process that text as a string by building up a parser, parsing that string as XML, then running a bunch of query selectors on it to find all the items in here. There's 1 item, 2, 3, so we'll get all the items. Then for each of the items, we're going to build an array containing the title and the pub date, which we're going to convert into a date, and the MP3 information that comes from the enclosure in the URL attribute. So the only other thing to do then is, for that array that we just created, I need to set the row data to be that array of items. So if I save this, there we can see that the grid has refreshed to include all the title information, the date, and the episode. So let me get rid of my hard-coded data in here, because I don't need that anymore. It refreshed, pulled in the information again. So that's good. We have managed to pull in the information from the RSS feed. Parsing it, although it's XML, wasn't that hard because we're using the window DOM parser that is built in to JavaScript when we're working in a browser. So we can see that it would be quite nice to format some of these fields, and we clearly need to do something about rendering the MP3, because just having text doesn't help us. We're going to need to have some sort of audio player in here. But let's start by using some very simple AG-grid functionality to format some of these fields. So for the episode title, it would be quite good to wrap the text. So I'll use the wrap text attribute. Then it would be good to have the height of that field set automatically so that I don't have to worry about formatting it. And I think what we probably want to do is set the width. So I'm going to set this as a flexible width value so that this will take up proportionally 2 parts of this, which currently is half the grid. And just in case, let's make this resizable for the user so that they can adjust this themselves. So now we've got this resizing functionality in there, and it's a little bit easier for people to see what's going on. So for the publish date, I think it'd be quite useful if we could sort this grid to see the data. So I'll make this sortable. Because it's a date, we can sort quite easily. So if I make that sortable now, when I come in here, I can sort to go back to the first episode, see that quite easily, and then the last episode. So we've got sorting for free here pretty much. And there we can see the results of the auto height and the word wrap. And let's make the episode itself flex to be to there. Oops, what did I do? Oh, there we go. Comma. There we go. So if I make that a little bit wider as we'd expect, then we can see that we've got the published date in here, which is sortable. I could later on bring in a formatter here so that I'm not seeing the time, but with the grid set out like that, that's just fine. So we've got the data in. The next thing, I guess, is to try and allow us to hear the episodes. So AG-grid allows us to create fairly simple cell renderers to represent whatever data we want on the screen. So I'm going to create a simple cell renderer to render the MP3 here as an HTML5 audio player. And the simplest way to do that in my code is to just have in the MP3 itself a cell renderer. And that's going to take some parameters from the grid so that I know what the URL is going to be. and this will just render the text that we put in here. So I'm going to have an audio HTML5 with controls, and I do not want it to preload because then the entire grid would be loading in all the MP3 files. I don't want that. I only want it to load in the MP3 file when the user clicks play. So we'll style this a little bit to allow it to fit into the row height. So height 2M, and we'll vertical align this in the middle. So for that audio control, I will now need to set the source, and the source is going to be the value that is coming in from the params. So that's the params value, because that's currently what we've stored in the data. And this is of type audio/MPEG. If I save that, then as if by magic, we now have the episodes rendered in an audio HTML5, which should allow us to start playing that information. So I've got now a very basic podcast player with AGGrid doing the heavy lifting by loading in the RSS feed directly into the grid for row data. We've got sorting for essentially free by changing one of the fields here. I've got resizable information that's being formatted, and we're rendering it on the grid in an audio player using a cellRenderer. So great, I've got my basic podcast player. So currently we're hard-coded to just have the WebRush podcast, which is great, but ideally I would like to configure it for anything else. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to amend this to have an input field where I can just add the RSS feed URL, and we'll bring it in from there. And then we'll call part 1 of this podcast player done. And in part 2, we'll add more features and filtering and things like that. So let's make an input field. What we currently have is the RSS feed hard-coded in as a property on the grid in the app.js. So the simplest thing I could do that would work is to add an input field in the app.js to let us type in an RSS field. So to do that, I'm going to add some state into here. So let's import React and use state. Remember to spell it correctly this time. And we're going to bring that in from React. So now I can add state into this app component, const RSS feed, and we'll set the RSS feed, and this will use state for the value that we currently have hard-coded here. So I'm still hard-coding it, but I'm setting it via state to make it a little bit easier to amend. And so my prop setup here should use the RSS feed. So there should be no change to the app. Good. And what we want to do is add an input. Now I could make this a separate component, but I'm just going to put this directly in here. So we'll add a div, and I'll have a label, and that'll be for my RSS feed URL input that I'm going to add, and that will be RSS feed URL. So my label will need an input, and that's going to be type text with an ID to match the label, which is RSS feed URL, and I'll give it a name for the RSS feed URL. And let's set some styling up. So width will be 80%, and I'm going to use a default value here, which means that this is going to be an unmanaged by React component, which means the user can amend this without us having to write much code in React. So it's basically just going to be a very simple input field on the page, which is initially set by the value from the state, which the user can amend, but when they click a button, then it will set the state. So let's handle load feed click in this load feed button. So now I better write this handle load feed click. So const handle load feed click is a function, and it will get the input RSS feed value from the unmanaged field. We'll use the ID to get it, which is the RSS feed URL, and we'll get the value. And then we'll set the RSS feed to that value. So this is the fastest way I can think of for adding an input field onto the screen. Let's reduce the size a little bit, where I could type in any other podcast URL and we can load it into the app. So let me just quickly get a podcast URL. So there's a URL pasted in for the Evil Tester Show. We'll load the feed. I can see that we have, or I have, used the ARIA value rather than the value, and I can see that rather than setting a style, which I should have done, I set the width directly. So let's set the width via the style, then that should format better. There we go. So now I have styled the input field to be 80%, and I'm using the value. So now when I click the load feed button, it should work. So there it goes. So now I've got the Evil Tester Show URL in there, and let me switch back to the WebRush podcast, and there we go. So now I can load any feed in there. This isn't the most robust application, obviously. If we type in an invalid feed, it's not going to detect it. And we're limited by the browser itself, so that all the feeds we're using have to be CORS compatible. The cross-origin resource sharing has to be configured on the other site to allow me to fetch the data from a browser. If the CORS is not set, then we won't be able to access that feed from the browser, and we'll see a CORS error in the dev console. However, this currently is a perfectly valid podcast player that allows us to type in the RSS feed from a podcast, load the feed, and play the episodes. So before I move on, one thing I should really do is fix the test, because I've not really added any tests in here. We do have a test, and currently it's broken because I've changed the heading and haven't reflected that in the test. So let me amend the test here to match our current app. So let me call this the header element, and we'll just test that the H1 is telling us that this is the podcast player. So now if I stop this, I should be able to npm test, and we'll have a working application. So if I wanted to, I could check this into GitHub now, and it would work just fine. And we'll call this part 1 of the tutorial. In the next tutorial, we'll make the feed management a little bit easier. We'll add some filters. We'll start to use the description so that we can search on values in the description and just make this a little bit more robust. In fact, we'll add some pagination in there, make the user interface a little bit easier. So join me in part 2, where we continue to build the podcast player. And we're using AG Grid Community Edition, which is completely free, and we're using the React UI to build it in React. You can find out more information at aggrid.com.